In this fifth and final presentation of speakers from the event hosted by 19 Nurses and the Manchester Innocence Project, we're going to examine extracts from our last two speakers. The first presentation will be the full introductory segment related to 19 nurses who were, of course, centrally involved in the organisation of this meeting.
Good morning and welcome everybody. My name is actually irrelevant. I don't think the founders of 19 Nurses. We're here as a collective, not as an individual voice. Most of 19 Nurses like to stay anonymous because there is still quite a lot of vitriol at the moment with such a sensitive case. So, who are 19 Nurses? A lot of you already know who they are. For those who don't, we're a grassroots organisation that came about because of the conviction of Lucy Letby. Our only agenda is, because we are nurses, and we can see that this is one of the worst miscarriages of justice that has affected our own profession. So that's why we've got involved. We wish to bring awareness of Lucy's unsafe conviction. We want legal transparency, reform of the criminal justice system, and a safe culture in our NHS. Now, since we started 19 Nurses, which is only about a year ago, it was in the process before we had like a formal website before then. We've had hundreds of NHS workers contact us because of being bullied, for being scapegoated, or whistleblowing, retaliation. And it's really opened my eyes. I've not had a bad career. I have seen some bullying. I've, in my younger days, been subjected to a teeny, minuscule bit of bullying, but I never realised how bad it was. And I never realised, I thought doctors were safe. I really did think doctors were safe because of hierarchy, but they're not. And there must be some NHS blacklist somewhere that there's a list of people on who can no longer work within that area, because there's so many people who have whistleblowed, who have told me that they couldn't get a job within the NHS again. So they've got to hold some form of database. So our mission is, we have been calling for an independent review of Lucy's case. We know that won't happen now, but, you know, we're hoping the CCRC will be quick to refer Lucy's case back to the Courts of Appeal. We want fair legal processes to address systemic NHS issues and support whistleblowing transparency. So we began with just 19 nurses. We began in a very small group, and I counted up when we wrote a letter to Keir Starmer about our concerns with the Lucy Letby case, asking for either a royal commission or an independent scientific review of the case. And there was 19 of us. Just before, I think, the Telegraph published the letter, as a couple of people got worried of having their names attached to it, so they dropped out, but a couple of my work colleagues took that place. So in the beginning, there was just 19 nurses, so that's how our name came about. We're now, I think, 654 members of the 19 Nurses website. I checked that last night. And that's not just nurses, that's doctors, radiographers, professors, dentists. We've even got a vet on there. You know, so it's health professionals from the whole of the spectrum. So we formed in response to Lucy's conviction. We operate anonymously because there are, like I said earlier, people who are whistleblowing, who have received whistleblowing retaliation. And there's current practicing nurses who are feared of vindictive keyboard warriors and things like that. So our key achievements is we sent the letter to Kirstama with the initial 19 nurses and 279 health professionals signed that letter within 3 days of it going up on a website so that others could join us. We tried to engage with the Prime Minister, but obviously we're too lowly for him to come back to us. So the Justice Secretary came back to us with the usual, there's a justice system, there's a process. And then we went back to the Justice Secretary with concerns around the CPS, and we got another benign reply to that. And we've done a number of press releases. We're trying to engage the unions. And as of this moment, we have not had one reply for any NHS union. And that doesn't bode well for those of us who are currently in practice. This is two of our founders who are retired, who don't mind their photo going up, delivering the letter to 10 Downing Street. We have compiled a leaflet. We have some with us so that the general public to bring awareness. So if you can take some of those home with you, that would be great. Now, there's not only Lucy in prison. This is what brought us to the party, want of a better word. There's Colin Norris, Ben Geen, Victorina Cho, and there's also the Deborah Novak case as well, who was a nurse who was convicted, I think, of the murder of her husband with insulin. Now, our next steps. We're in the process of becoming a non-for-profit group. And when this comes about, we are going to commission some academic and scientific research into the parallels between all the cases. Because I think it is important to look at all the cases because the parallels are quite uncanny. And we need to be advising the courts and putting gold standards before the courts of what can actually even get past that threshold to be brought into the court. So if they've got a gold standard and somebody's case isn't meeting that, it's thrown out at the start. And another thing that we're quite worried about is the appeal courts are actually using junk science to then influence other cases. So it becomes case law, the junk science. So we want to try and change that. And I think being a non-profit group, we're not asking for general public funding. We will apply for funding. Then we can really commission some really good work to help all the nurses, not just Lucy. Obviously, Lucy's very important. But you help one, you help all, I think. So just to say, today has been completely pro bono, all speakers, Claire, Professor Claire from the Institute has enabled today. We really thank Claire for working, with 19 nurses. I want to also thank Dr. Roger Norris, two of my co-founders. They can mention their names if they want to. Dr. Keith Wilkinson in the corner there, and Christopher Morris for making this day work. And that's me for now. Thank you.
I will encourage people once again to join 19 Nurses, particularly if you are a registered nurse. Also, if you are more broadly a healthcare professional, While they are very passionate advocates for Lucy, I know that their work will not end when she is exonerated. Our next and final speaker is Professor John O'Quigley. Professor O'Quigley is Professor of Statistics in the Department of Statistical Science, University College London. Professor O'Quigley's academic career began as MRC Research Scientist at the University of Leeds, a stint followed by several positions in France, the most recent being in the Laboratory of Probability Statistics and Modelling at the University of Paris-Sorbonne. Much of Professor O'Quigley's career was spent in the United States, mainly in the Department of Mathematics, University of California, San Diego, during which time he was a tenured full professor of mathematics. He was also director of the Laboratory for Mathematics and Statistics. Prior to that, Professor O'Quigley was a researcher at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center and the Department of Biostatistics, University of Washington, Seattle. Several years were also spent as full professor at the University of Virginia Medical School, as well as the Department of Mathematics at Lancaster University in this country. He has been a passionate advocate of Lucy Letby for some time. I should say that I've known John for a while and he will appear on the channel soon. We're just waiting for something to be resolved. With that being said, in this first segment, Professor O'Quigley explains why the shift chart that was central to the prosecution is, to coin an American phrase, baloney.
I've discussed this several times with my colleague Richard Gill, and we would agree, and think any statistician would agree, it's very hard to know what constitutes an inexplicable spike. That is a whole topic for investigation. So 8 deaths in 2014, was that an inexplicable spike or not? Something that needs work, needs attention, and really needs a high level of expertise. You cannot just look at it and say, that's inexplicable. The only possible explanation then has to be something else outside of all normal explanations. A crime has been committed. Essentially, that's what's happened. We could say more about that, but given the limitations on time, I will not. I'm going to focus on the second aspect in the Nurse Letby case. And this is very interesting, by the way. In so many other cases like this, it's based on the idea, number one, that there is an inexplicable spike. That is a statistical argument. And number two, not only is there a spike which points to a crime, but we have statistical evidence that shows the accused as the only possible culprit. So there are two parts to the case. It's interesting that the prosecution's expert witness, Dowie Evans, it's not a name that usually slips me, but it did. He claims that statistics had nothing to do with it. Nothing to do with it. Whereas as far as I can see, it has not just everything to do with it, but there's nothing else that really is at the core of it, for the simple reason that all of these other complex issues relating to insulin, to overfeeding with milk, fantastical notions, of course, and they're more or less, I think the milk one is probably the most fantastical, but they're all more or less fantastical notions. And the thing is that none of them point to Nurse Letby. None of them. So even if we agree with them, we may agree to all sorts of fantastical ideas, but they do not point at Nurse Lucy Letby. The only one thing pointing at Nurse Letby was the statistics. And even the spike was not pointing at Nurse Letby, because what? There's a spike, okay. So that's what I'm going to focus my attention on because of the time. And that's what we're going to be looking at, this roster chart mostly. There are other areas, and this is not my field at all, the areas of psychology, because not only does this crime, nobody saw anyone doing anything wrong, and they recognize that. There were no witnesses, and there was no material evidence initially. They're building up the case later on via speculation of how these things may have happened, but there was no material evidence. And then, of course, finally, you say, what is the motive? What is the motive? Well, they couldn't find any motive. There's no obvious motive either. And that's where, the Munchausen by proxy syndrome, which has got a fancier name now, they don't tend to use that one anymore. But interestingly enough, I discovered that this, I'm not sure if everyone's probably familiar with it, it's just the idea, actually we used to call it People used to say they're sick, something's wrong. We all know people like that. There's always something wrong with them, you know. And then they say, well, it's projected onto somebody else. Who invented this theory? For those that don't know, this whole theory was invented by none other than Roy Meadow, Sir Roy Meadow, the colleague, by the way, of Dowie Evans, because Roy Meadow, for his infamous work concerning Sally Clark, was struck off the medical council. He was not able to practice in England. A campaign got him back, and one of the leaders of the campaign turned out to be none other than our good friend Dowie Evans. So objective inference is going to be rather more simple. It's just based on accepted scientific principles. And by that, I mean things like, if proposition A is true, proposition B, and it implies B, B implies C, then I know that A implies C. There are basic logical arguments which we all studied, probably not these days, but we did at one point a long time ago. And it's basic, accepted scientific principles, not based on opinions of anybody. And the second thing, which is very important, is that they can be replicated independently. Fake science. Now, this is a term that's used in science. We say that is fake science. And when we describe something as fake science, it usually refers to claims which are not verifiable. It fails this second condition. We cannot. So somebody says, I can run a car on water. So, okay, that sounds cool. How do you do that? And I said, well, it's, I don't want to tell you because the petrol companies will, destroy the patent or something. So I'm going to keep it to myself. And he said, well, listen, that is fake science. Doesn't mean to say it's not true. That's the interesting thing here. It may be true. I think it's unlikely, but it may be. And that's not the issue. The issue is, can it be independently replicated? And if it can, and actually this was very much the basis of the so-called peer review system. It's gone a long way from that these days, but there was a time, and I'm going back a long time now, in science when the idea was, okay, you tell us what you did, and we're going to see if we can do the same thing. If we can, well, then you're on the money. If not, we need a revision. Okay, that's what I'm saying here. Let's just look at some of the rhetoric. I mean, the rhetoric surrounding Nurse Letby is quite astonishing, really, when you look at it. So we kick off, of course, with our friend Professor Jayaran. There was a statistically significant spike in the rate of deaths in 2015. Well, this is just not true. This is absolutely not true. And either he doesn't know what he's talking about, which is a possibility, or he's rather, well, I'm being diplomatic, or he's very careless in his use of language, because this means a very precise thing, actually, in scientific circles. Anyone publishing, any scientist who publishes will know this is a very precise statement. So, and it never happened, so he's describing an event which did not take place. Here's another thing here, and then we're going to come, this is going to be the focus, I think, of much of what we're talking about. Whenever there's a problem, the nurse was always there. How many times have we heard that? How many times have I read that? They said, well, but she was always there. Okay. And then, of course, as was mentioned earlier by more than one of the presenters, the contradiction of the pathologist's work. This is astonishing, And Stephanie talked about this, going back and reevaluating the cause of death, not only the cause of death, but the manner in which the death could. This is astonishing. I mean, it really is quite astonishing when you think of it. And of course, at every turn, linking this to the nurse in question, Then the behavior, notes, all of that. All of this, common denominator, that's the same as she's always there when there's a problem. And this is from one of our journalist friends. I think I believe, from the BBC, what's her name, Judith something. The probability of being present for so many deaths is vanishingly small. Where did that come from? Where did she get that? She just made it up off the top of her head. But it's convincing. This is rhetoric. It's convincing. You sound. You think, oh wow. But where did it come from? Did she do anything? Did she ask any did she ask anyone to look at this and determine whether or not these things are vanishing and what exactly? Being present for what? Where? When? I mean, it's full of vagueness. It's just nothing but rhetoric. And of course, the final thing was when she was removed from the unit, then the deaths dropped dramatically. Aha, there we have it. You know, I've heard this I've seen it written many times, and I've certainly seen people express that. When you explain to them that the unit was downgraded at the exact same time and was no longer treating anything like the same level of acuity among the babies, I said, well, they saw this somewhere. Okay. So all of this is pure rhetoric, and that's it. No more than that. So the hard evidence, here's the hard evidence against Nurse Letby. I think everything else there should have been dismissed immediately. And the hard evidence, well, it won't be dismissed immediately, but it will be dismissed pretty quickly. So this is what the jury saw. And the first time I saw the charts, I myself thought, wow, you know. The reason I initially was favouring the case of Nurse Letby without knowing anything really about it was, I said, I've seen this before. I was thinking of Sally Clark. And I said, you know, this sounds a little odd, you know. And but then somebody showed me this chart. I said, but look at this, you know, how can you explain that? And when I saw it, I thought, wow, that does look interesting. But that's all it is. This is rhetoric in the form of a chart, you know, because it does convince us, of course, but actually there's nothing there to convince us, because ultimately this chart is a fake. I did point that out at a meeting of the Royal Statistical Society in London, and the reason it's a fake is it's a scientific fake. Whether we're going to judge it as a grand fake doesn't mean it's a forgery. It means it's a scientific fake which cannot be reproduced, and we'll see why. This cannot be reproduced. And so the chart we're presented, it does not correspond to the chart that was created. They're different things. I'm not going to say much about this. This is the case of Beverly Allett, which I think is nonetheless interesting. This is a picture which is not nearly as clear as the other one. I recognize that. But if you can read it, all of the bit in the middle is just a gap. Every single case is crossed in the same way. Everything looks the same. Now, I know very little about the case of Beverly Allett, so I'm certainly not going to say much about that. But I think there has to be a question mark there. I feel relatively confident that given all of this information, if I had the same information that I had with Nurse Letby, I feel that this chart is also a fake. In other words, it does not correspond to what the jury believed it corresponded to. And we're going back a long time now to Beverly Allett. I'm not sure how long ago, but a long time ago, you know, maybe 2 decades, I don't know.
So, as I was discussing with Ollie Buxton recently, this is why, in the event of a retrial, the prosecution could never reuse the prosecution case from the first trial, because they cannot use the shift chart. I'm going to go on to explain why that is so important after the next segment of Professor O'Quigley. In this second part, he goes on to explain further why there are massive problems with the statistical case that was used in court.
There will be several iterations. We'll add new cases, we take away certain ones. And this is the fake chart that we get, the one we were just looking at. Everything's filled in. That is the fake chart shown to the jury. So what did the jury see? And this is just my opinion. I mean, I wasn't on the jury. What did they see? I think that's what they saw. My suspicion is that is what they saw. It's certainly what the everyday Joe saw when he was looking at it. That's what they saw. And more deeply, that is what they saw. So all of this other information, they didn't even, not only did they not take account of it, they were essentially even unaware of it. It just didn't, it was irrelevant. It's actually highly relevant, but it was treated as though it were not relevant. And that's all that matters. And on the basis of that, well, you know, they'll say anytime there's something suspicious, she happens to be there, 100% of the time. But we're going to do, I think I've got time to do that, a few minutes, a different analysis which gets rid of all of the bias, all of the selection bias and the confirmation bias. We have to do things differently. And we have to do it the opposite way around, actually. What I need to do is I look at that line, and boom, that's what I do with that. Gone. So nurse 23, by the way, is Nurse Letby. It just became more convenient to refer to the nurse, because in this work, if just the name Letby is like a lightning rod, it causes problems. So in an academic analysis, I do not name anyone. I just talk about events and the numbers of the nurses I present. But this is the data. This is the same data. So if we take out nurse 23, it's gone. There's nothing there. What remains, I can analyze and carry out a statistical analysis of what's left. And the bias has gone too. So what am I going to do? I'm going to build a simple model, very simple. But what we need to know, it sounds, of course, when you talk about building a model straight away, unless you're used to doing this, and people, statisticians and epidemiologists, they do this all the time. But what does it mean more generally? When you build a model, it just means you're agreeing to certain assumptions. That's all a model is. It's no more, no less. We follow Descartes, we want to write it down mathematically, but we're just agreeing to certain assumptions. So what are those assumptions we're agreeing to? Well, here they are. Number one, the inference will not depend on how the events are labeled. Now, that sounds very reasonable. And in fact, the reason I came up with that was I thought, well, I've no idea what one corresponds to. Is one the first event in time? Two, and maybe some of them were, but maybe others were not. We don't really know. And certainly in other cases, we don't know. Was it the first one put forward? That numbering 1 to 25, 1 to 61, all of the events, suspicious and non-suspicious, we don't know exactly how they're put together. So I want my techniques to ignore that. In other words, if I shuffle the information around, the answer has to be the same. If not, then that's a suspect technique. It does not depend either on the number of non-suspicious events. So if I add to the non-suspicious events and I go from 36 to say 100, I don't want my answer to depend upon that. So that's another important thing. And here's the thing I was mentioning earlier. The probability of presence for non-suspected nurses is independent of whether an event is deemed suspicious or not. That is a strong assumption in statistical theory, but it's a very reasonable one in this particular context. It buys us a lot, actually. Number one and number three, they buy us all we need. They buy us a lot. At non-suspicious events, we're going to say, for the suspected nurse, for nurse 23, will be the average time on duty for everyone else as a start. And we can play with that. We can change these if we wish, Now, here's something that sounds a little bit technical, and it is technical. The probability of presence for the suspected nurse relates to that of non-suspected nurses via what we call a proportional hazards transform. Richard will know very well what I'm talking about, but maybe not many people will. This is just a statistical model. For those who work in clinical trials, you will have seen this model a lot because it's used all the time. Actually, with a colleague at the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York, we reviewed a 3 years' work of the New England Journal of Medicine, clinical trials with an endpoint of survival. And more than 80% of those studies were leaned on the proportional hazards model to obtain their results. So this is a very popular, commonly used, solid model used in epidemiology and statistics. But in our case, we have a great advantage in that assumption number 5 is a direct result of number 1. So if I assume that I can permute the labels of events, then number 5 is not an assumption, it's a consequence of that. And this is just it sounds technical again, beta binomial density, what's that? It's just a representation. It's not really an assumption. We'll see that in a second. So we need this is the only page with a hint of mathematics in it, and it's very minor. But it follows on from the previous page. So these are the things we need, the cumulative probability of being present. So I choose a random nurse. What is the probability that he or she were present for one or more events? What is the probability that they're present for 2 or more, 3 or more, 4 or more? We need to come up with some notation for that. And less is just the mirror image, you know? So we're going to call it F0J for a randomly chosen nurse, F23J for nurse 23. When the events are suspicious, we're going to call it G0 and G23. And for non-suspicious, H0, H23, we have that. And what we more or less were saying earlier on, and we can show this mathematically, we get this simple result, that all of these things are all the same for the set of non-suspect nurses. So this allows me to use all of the information in the chart to get a very accurate summary of the survival experience of all the non-accused nurses. And then what I'm going to do is to, again, assumption number one, will allow me to estimate what we call the relative risk, which pops up again a lot in clinical trial methodology. And it's just a ratio of the two survival curves. So one I can work out without bias, I know that, and the other one I can work out via this transform. So all of these assumptions that caused initially the confirmation bias and the selection bias, those have gone. And this is something, the RR is the relative risk, OR is the odds ratio, but we get a result there that we can use. So it's not so important for us, but we're going to use that technical. It's just a technical result, and this is what we get, which is the red line is just the beta binomial. It's a fit to the data. But if I didn't come up with a model like that, you can come up with a different one. It's never going to be that different from that. And actually, you can come up with a non-parametric analysis where you do not even need to fit a parametric model. And you get all of the probabilities going with that. We're just modeling them. So we can then use that modeling to, I'll try and wrap up fast. I just have a minute or two, I guess. Sorry, I'm nearly there. So on the basis of that, I can work out the survival distribution. This is for the presence probabilities of the non-accused nurses. And we can see to get 25 or more events is very, very small. It's 0.013 already for them. I can use my transform now. So the black line is that same line for the non-accused nurses. The blue line is nurse 23, based on those calculations. Now what? So you might say, wow, well, there's a bit of a difference here. There certainly looks to be a difference between those two curves. We look at the left-hand curve. Now, the shaded area, that's giving us the mean. That's the area under the curve, and we give the means up there. So there certainly looks like a difference. You think, wow, nurse 23, one way or another, she's not there 100% of the time, as was implied. This is around 10%, which is very, very far from 100%. But nonetheless, it does look to be rather greater than the other shifts. However, that does not account for the fact that all of that particular nurse 23, was working more on average, quite a bit more on average than the other nurses. So if instead of comparing with everyone, we just compare with nurses working more than the average, that's on the left, and then those working in an equivalent number of hours on the right, all of that difference disappears entirely. So the conclusion is the statistical evidence is worthless. And the reason I chose the word worthless was I'm quoting Lord Judge Jackson, who referred to Dowie Evans' evidence as worthless, and of course he was correct. So that's why I used that. There was no evidence of a spike, and I'm not really gone into that here because there's no time, but we can show that there is no evidence of a spike. Certainly, the Countess of Chester was one of the poorest performers, and the report of the Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health in 2016 outlined all of the problems. So it was like a perfect storm. These things coming together. It's like an airline crash. You know, whenever you look, any airline investigator, there's never one thing, never, ever. There's always a whole bunch of things that just happened. And I think it's very much the same. There were just too many things all happened at the same time. So the roster chart is also worthless. It is a scientific fake because it cannot be reproduced, and it cannot be used to show correlation as claimed. And what we find ultimately is if we use the information on the presence of non-accused nurses to recalculate the probability of a nurse 23, then it's no greater than that of about 5 or 6 other nurses working equivalent amount of time. So if I were talking to the Cheshire Police, my advice would be to them is that you need to try and identify those 5 or 6 nurses and figure out among them which one of those is the real culprit. You may have the wrong one. And so it could be one of those 5 or 6, unless that is there is no culprit, unless that is there never was any crime. Yeah. Thank you very much.
So the reason that this is so important, quite apart from the fact that one of the major artifacts of such a major court case has absolutely no merit, is that an enormous amount of inference was used in the initial prosecution case, particularly with regard to the early infants. In the early infants, a certain template was established that was then essentially photocopied throughout the remainder of the case. And what they would say once they'd established the situation with these early infants, they'd say, oh look, we know it's Lucy Letby because look at those early cases. Of course, we now know child A and child B, there are major problems with the obstetrics and major problems with the pregnancy, major problems with the mother and various illnesses, etc., etc. Child C is very obviously a bowel obstruction. Child D is just a massive failure from the hospital. So if you put those cases together, they are the cases on which the whole court case hangs essentially, because they just use the inferences of those cases for all of the other cases after that, apart from the insulin cases, which are of course based on flawed methodology as well. But all the way through the remainder of the court case, you would hear the prosecuting barrister, Nick Johnson, make assertions about, well, of course we know it's Lucy Letby because it could only be Lucy. They almost didn't have to prove anything once they hammered away at those early cases, because then after that, a lot of the later cases are highly tenuous, extremely tenuous, unbelievably tenuous, in fact. So I have on the screen now just a few of those examples. We see very early on with regard to the collapse of child A, Lucy Letby was present. Then later on, Miss Letby was present when those 3 children died in 2015. Then with regard to child C, Mr. Johnson talks about Lucy being present, although we know they've moved the dates around for this. Then with regard to child L, Lucy's on the other side of the room, but she's present. Then child H again, Dr. gives evidence to say that when he arrived, Lucy Letby was present. Then with child K, even though Lucy probably wasn't even in the room, Dr. Joram says Lucy was present doing nothing. Then of course we see reference in the last post here to the so-called heat map of total staffing presence that said Lucy was present for all 24 events, although we know that to be untrue. So you see that these are just a few examples. There are many, many more. So all of this being asserted all of the way through the court case, and this continual inference is being made. Eventually, Lucy becomes guilty just because she's a nurse in a hospital who happens to be on shift and somewhere in the vicinity of a supposedly suspicious collapse. Although, are they actually suspicious? Are they actually unexplained? Or are there actually very clear physical reasons for these collapses? But they just essentially said, oh look, Dr. Evans says this is a bit suspicious. Oh yeah, well, it couldn't possibly have been anyone else. Look, Lucy was in the basic vicinity of the incident, so we don't even need to know if she was there or not. This chart says she was there, so we'll say she's guilty. And that fools a lot of people. It fooled a lot of people in the court case. It fooled court observers and reporters. It fooled people in the immediate aftermath of the verdict. Of course, in actual fact, there is no foundation for this assertion whatsoever. It has absolutely no scientific merit at all. There wouldn't be any foundation for it, even if we didn't know for a fact that Lucy wasn't around for a lot of the collapses. Even if she was around for the collapses, i.e. on duty and could be placed at the exact location where the collapses occurred, which isn't the case for approximately 50% of the collapses in the court case, even if that were the case, it still wouldn't have any credibility. But given that we know she's not around for a lot of the collapses, and that even the collapses that she is around for, there are some extraordinary logistical circumstances that need to occur, that are just not plausible. So all of the inference that is derived from this is worthless, is completely worthless, and in a retrial it would be demolished, utterly demolished. And that is why the prosecution could never reuse the prosecution case that it used in the first trial. They would have to do something completely different. As I've suggested, they may focus on a few of the unanimous cases. There were 3 unanimous cases, child F, child L, and child O. As far as I understand it, they could do that. But they cannot put the shift chart in the court case, and they cannot put the original prosecution case in the court. They cannot say, oh look, Lucy was on duty, it must be Lucy then. The it's always Lucy theory as I describe it. That just simply cannot be in the retrial. It's completely impossible. So that brings to an end my presentations from the event in Manchester. I want to say thank you firstly to 19 Nurses for allowing me to use these clips and to share them with you. It's made my job of creating content this month quite a bit easier, while I've been busy working on my book with the aim of completing the final draft for the end of December, which is essential. Thank you for all of your ongoing support, and in January I'm not quite sure what content I will make, but there will be more of my usual deep dive videos, and I will definitely have some more interviews. I've put an enormous and unusually large amount of interviews on the channel this month because they're a little bit easier to make than the deep dive videos. There will definitely be some interviews next month, but it will be quite significantly less. I'm not quite sure how that will work or who will come on, but there are numerous people that will be coming on for interviews, and I'll keep that going for as long as I can. With that being said, thank you for the support, and I'll look forward to reading your comments.